how does one quantify that which doesn't necessarily lend itself to quantification? And in fact, quantification likely doesn't do it justice. My life's work has been about bridging different ways of knowing and world experiences. As you know, I'm a medical anthropologist, so I'm a scientist and committed to the empirical process to acquire and generate the evidence behind various kinds of interventions with respect to health and illness in Native people. At the same time, I'm also a Native person. I'm Pemina Chippewa from the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and have had the privilege of knowing that there are many things in our world that work, but haven't benefited from the same kind of evidence that the biomedical world places such great emphasis on. And that's really at the heart of my work. And I had this wonderful opportunity back in the mid to late 1990s. It was in the context of an attempt to replicate the Matsunaga Vietnam Veterans Study. We knew in 1975, when our military personnel began returning to the United States, coming home, that they were experiencing enormous difficulty in reintegrating into their communities. And the government undertook a major study to understand what the consequences of combat and related experiences were for these veterans as they sought to return to their families and their communities. And the evidence was unequivocal that the nature of combat and the horrors that it brings had enormous impact on them and compromised their ability to live productive, meaningful lives. The original study included African American and Hispanic Vietnam combat veterans, but Asian American, Native Hawaiian, American Indian, Alaskan Native combat veterans had not been included in the study, so there wasn't as much evidence and thus momentum to improve the services to address their needs. And so I was privileged to lead the study focusing on American Indian Vietnam combat veterans. And in that regard, the study dealt with two of the three largest reservation-based tribal communities in the country. And so as we pursued this study with the tribal nations in question, particularly the Navajo, they felt very strongly that their tribal ceremonies, their traditional healing rituals were absolutely critical and previously unrecognized outside of the nation itself in enabling these Navajo combat veterans to address post-traumatic stress disorder in their lives. Importantly, they felt that there might be the opportunity to be reimbursed and to underwrite the cost of these tribal ceremonies. I was a little uncomfortable bringing to bear Western science to address these kinds of questions because I thought there was, the challenge of perhaps polluting the sacred with the profane. First off, it was absolutely clear for those Vietnam combat veterans from Navajo who participated in tribal ceremonies before being deployed to Vietnam in combat, compared to their peers who did not participate in the tribal ceremonies, that the former were less likely, given similar levels of exposure to combat and the other kinds of risks that would attend to increase likelihood of contracting post-traumatic stress disorder, that they were less likely to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And among those who returned and continued or initially availed themselves of the traditional ceremonies, compared to their peers who did not, again, they were less likely to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And even if they did, that the onset, severity, duration, and the likely remission of the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms were likely to be less than their peers who did not have similar participation in tribal ceremonies. And so the data were unequivocal, and we had, for the very first time, scientific evidence from a biomedical perspective that these traditional ceremonies were efficacious in all terms, from not only the traditional Navajo perspective, but also from the perspective of Western biomedicine. And so the Navajo Nation took that evidence and went forward to Congress and to senior leadership of the Veterans Administration. I had the privilege of being part of those conversations and made the case that, in fact, not just simply as a matter of altruism, not just simply as a matter of diversity and inclusion, but as a matter of actual cold costs and the economics of care, that by investing in these kinds of tribal ceremonies, the VA would recoup and actually benefit from lowered costs for caring for these Navajo veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And the result was a memorandum of agreement signed between the Navajo Nation and the Veteran Health Administration in April of 1998 that listed out 13 tribal ceremonies, scheduled a compensation, level of compensation for each of these ceremonies, and established mechanisms by which veterans who were seen and their care was coordinated through the Department of Navajo Veterans Affairs within the tribal organization would receive compensation for those kinds of services, and the singers or the healers or hatle who would perform those ceremonies would be reimbursed. And that agreement continues to today. It's really, truly a hallmark, and I think is a major testimony to what's possible when you marry the best that Western science has to offer with the views and the aspirations of tribal people about these different ways of knowing and the possible impacts that they may have.